There is the suicide, excuse me. There's the suicide rates back in 1418 and the latest ones in Taiwan. You know that, all of you already, I'm sure. How accurately are these figures recorded? I've talked about the populations. This is data from East Asia. One of the points that I made earlier is that many countries, the suicide data are believed to be inaccurate. They're okay in Korea, they're okay in Japan, they're okay in Singapore. The rest of these countries listed here, the quality of their mortality statistics is believed to be poor or not good anyway. So we can't trust them. These are the English-speaking countries. And the interest here is that 2% of deaths, of all deaths in those countries are suicides. The gender ratios are all over the 3-to-1 mark, which is interesting. This is the gender ratios throughout the world, 1.84-to-1, whereas in the English-speaking ones, it's over 3-to-1. And in Europe, it's also over that. The limitations of the data, there are differences between the countries and over time in the way the data are collected and hidden suicides. These are the age patterns of suicide in Taiwan in recent years. The top one is the male, and the thicker line is the latest one. The bottom one's female, and the thicker line is the latest one. And these are what we call an upward sloping graph, upward sloping age pattern reaching their height in old age. There's Taiwan back in the early 90s. That's the next one in the late 90s. This is 5 years later. And this is in 2004 to 8. So you see that the suicide rate doubled, more than doubled. This is the males. In the younger age groups, stayed much the same in old age. It came down a bit in 2009 to 13, and I'll show you the latest figures later, the latest pattern. These are females, always almost the same over the years, but notice that it's fairly flat. It's just somewhat upward sloping, and it stayed that way for decades. And this is the age patterns of Taiwan over recent years. And the most recent one, the male one, is in black above and the red below. And there's been a change. The suicide rate in Taiwan has dropped, among males anyway, and somewhat dropped in females. But it's still the same upward sloping pattern. So those are the two. These are the types of age pattern we could refer to. That was upward sloping. I'll show you convex, I'll show you downward sloping, I'll show you bimodal, and the uniform means flat. So that's upward sloping in Hong Kong, upward sloping female in Hong Kong, except I want you to notice particularly the way the rate of suicide in old age in Hong Kong has fallen since the early 80s to 2009-13, and it's gone on falling. It's a big drop in the old age rate, whereas the earlier rate, it stays fairly uniformly flat. This is in rural China, mainland China, and this is in rural China, but the rates have dropped. There's male and female, and the rates have dropped in China, and you can probably comment more on that. That's urban China. But upward sloping, there's Korea, this extraordinary increase in the rate, the age patterns for both male and female, both upward sloping. All these countries in Asia, upward sloping. But Japan is the one of most interest to me. This was in the early 60s or mid 60s. This is males. This is the green one shows the rate in the early 80s. That's gone up into the mid-90s, the blue one, and you see a change in pattern from that red one, which was in the 60s. You've got this middle-age peak around late 50s, early 50s, but the old age rate stays much the same, still pretty high, but it's come down a bit in the 1990s. And then here's the one in 2009-13. I have got a later picture, a graph of this, but the rate has come down in old age among males by 2009-13. So it's a sort of trimodal picture. There's the comparison of the 60s and the early 2000s. Trimodal. Why was Japan's male old age suicide rate so high in the 60s? And why did it progressively fall? You tell me. Why the rise in male late middle-age suicide? How much has it got to do with all the events that have happened in the world and in Japan over the years? But why has the Japan rate become so like America's? This is the females, showing again this fall in the old age rate, a fantastic fall, so that the black was the rate in 2009-13, where it's a uniformly flat rate among women, very different from what it was in the 60s. And this is comparing the two, 60s and more recently. This is the rates in 2020. I got the 10-year age bands, and you see it's flat almost, just a bit of a rise in old age among males, female flat, and very different from what you've got in Taiwan, what they've got in Korea. Korea has dropped, the rate has come down. So that's interesting. Age patterns of suicide do differ between English-speaking and Asian jurisdictions. Let's call it East Asia and the Anglo-Saxons, because these are English-speaking countries. And we could compare suicide in Taiwan and Australia. We've talked about that a bit, and this would be relevant if we ever get round to writing something. Here's the age patterns in Australia, and I'll flash through these. This is the late 60s, male, the early 80s, male, and here we're beginning to get a peak in the young age group, and I might show these slides again tomorrow, these ones in particular, in relation to youth suicide prevention and what's happened to youth suicide. This was what happened in the 90s, the late 90s. This is where male suicide reached its peak at age 20 to 24 and 25 to 20. It's in the 20s. An incredible rise, going up to nearly 40 per 100,000. But then what happens next? What do you think happens? What happened in Australia? It did. And this is it. We've got this bimodal picture in Australia, whereas look at the red one, that was an upward sloping one. Here's the drop in old age rate, people in their 60s, 70s, 80s, and it's still high at age 85, but otherwise it's completely different. It's now a bimodal compared to an upward sloping one. That's the difference between the two. And this is the 20s. This is just 1 year. That's why it's a bit sawtooth pattern. But it's still a bimodal one with a peak in the early 20s, staying fairly flat, and then low in old age up to age 85. And it's extraordinary rise at age 85 among males. That's the bimodal one. Why the change? Why is the rise in male youth suicide? Probably related to the sort of anomie that males felt at that time in the late 90s. A lot of it to do with drugs. And why the fall in old age male suicide? Was that related to better care among the elderly, more understanding by the government at that time, better provision of things, and a peak in the male middle age rate, which we also saw in Japan. What about the women? That's very flat, just the same rate from 20 to 90 over all those decades. So this is Australia compared with Taiwan. We've talked about that already. This is the US going up. The red one was the upward sloping. Then you have similar to Australia, a peak in youth among 20 to 29, still there later on. And then you've got still a bit of a peak in youth, but then the emergence of this middle-age peak in the 50s, drop in old age, but then rise in late old age among males. This is comparing it with the females, where there's a bit of a convex pattern among the females, stayed much the same. This is Japan, and I've already shown you that. This is Canada, similar to Japan, really. England and Wales is rise in middle age. This is 2015, but it's still somewhat similar. Bimodal pattern, similar to Australia. Ireland, very strange. It comes right down in old age. Somewhat similar, but the early part is the same. So that's comparing. Australia, Taiwan, we've looked at that. To what extent can these differences between countries, genders, and over time be explained by economic and socio-cultural changes affecting some or all of the populations? To what extent might the differences be explained by ongoing biological, racial, genetic factors? And this is the particular interest that I have. If we were ever to compare Taiwan with Australia, we could compare the East Asian pattern with the Anglo-Saxon pattern, and this change, extraordinary change, but Japan being so interesting. I showed this just to show a downward sloping pattern from Iran, where there's high peak in their 20s. Like various Middle Eastern countries, it's got downward sloping patterns, but the statistics are unreliable in Iran. That's downward sloping. This is the indigenous pattern in Australia. And I don't know about Taiwan, what you find in your indigenous groups, but it's a downward sloping pattern, so that again, I might show this slide tomorrow morning talking about suicide rate in youth, and why does this happen for the indigenous group in Australia, and why is it so different? Here's Labrador, much the same. No difference between Western and East Asian, but there are other patterns, such as the Iran pattern, Eastern Europe. Why the differences between countries, subpopulations? To what extent is it attributable to mental illness? And again, we've got this. I don't know if I've got a comparison later on of Western and East Asian various things that are different between them. And the fact that you believe that in East Asia, it's less due to mental illness and mental disorder, and maybe that's partly due to the impulsivity, young females taking suicide on an impulse. To what extent could it be that? To what extent is it due to mental perturbation rather than mental illness? Is that more common in China and Taiwan and Hong Kong? Is it situations, stress, hopelessness? What clues do the age patterns give us about causation? And certainly I think that brings up questions about late life suicide. Is that continuing higher rate among men aged 85 partly due to rational suicide? Is it related to what Ye Chen would say, what she was saying? Why the differences? Yes, we must be suspicious because, statistics, a majority of countries, we get inaccurate statistics. Taiwan's peak suicide rate among around 2006 coincided with the peak use of charcoal burning as a method, pesticides, but they can be used impulsively. So could that be a cause of some of these differences between West and East? Can we prevent suicide? Every suicide death highlights the importance of consistently implementing best practice techniques. A majority, but not all people who die by suicide have mental disorders, but nearly all have psychic hurt. And our aim should be to recognize the psychic and suppress it, thereby preventing suicide. This was Schneidman's term. It's a really good one, I think. It describes the hurt, anguish, ache that takes hold of the mind, introspectively felt mental pain of negative emotions such as guilt, shame, humiliation, fear, panic, angst, loneliness, helplessness, dread of growing old. A lot of those things, I mean, that doesn't apply to everyone, but psychache explains a lot of the suicides we see. It's not necessarily mental illness. It may be perturbation, which I don't know if that's an illness. I don't call it a disorder. Suicide occurs when the psychache is deemed to be unbearable. This is in relation to some of the prevention stuff that we talk, how it builds up to a stage where it's inevitable almost. And we've got to stop the unceasing flow of intolerable consciousness. What leads to psychache? Sociocultural groups vary in how they react to situations. Is there a difference between the cultures in Korea, Taiwan, compared with United States, Germany, Australia? Are we in the West much more individualistic in our cares? Does that apply to men more than women? What strengths and vulnerabilities do the different populations, Taiwan and Australia, Germany, whatever, have related to their culture and their genes? Is it related to upbringing, losses, Confucian ideas, whatever, traumatic experiences? Suicide and culture, there's a really good essay and discussion by Ben Park in Korea about this, which I haven't time to show you, but that's the Korean rate has come down since 2009-13, but it's still the same shape, the same age pattern. This is Ben Park's summary, which I haven't got time to read, but it's really good. Economic factors following the financial crisis, change from extended to nuclear family structure. Is this part of the cause for the increasing rate there? Collective cultural ambivalence, which he talks about. Slow government response, yes, we know about that. Female ambivalence, about traditional inequality, the move from females from rural to urban situations, etc. And so I think I won't go more into that. Saxby Pridmore is an Australian psychiatrist, and he, like me, believes, yes, suicide may be the result of mental disorder, but it may be due to a single socio-economic stressor, such as public disgrace, but more often it's the result of a number of stressors. It's a complex thing. Relationship failure, unemployment, drug and alcohol use, of course. And if you get all these at the same time, yes, it can lead to suicide. Here's a comparison of Eastern, Asian, and the Western ones, which I think you all know. The gender ratio is different between the two. Western meaning Anglo-Saxon in this case, etc. Issues to discuss. Is it understandable? Is it rational that some people kill themselves? Do personality characteristics make it difficult to tolerate disability or loss or insults, pain, diminished self-regard? And does this vary between East Asia and the Anglo-Saxon and European groups? Are some suicides altruistic due to feeling you're a burden? When you reach 85, to what extent do you feel a burden? I'm 83, incidentally. I'm not much of a burden yet, but I know what happens when you become a burden and you feel you ought to do away with yourself. Is it reasonable, rational for people to request euthanasia? And thank God some countries have now taken away the idea it's a crime for doctors to help. At the same time, we have to keep a very close eye on it. Look at the Netherlands and compare that and think how many of those people killed by euthanasia really needed to die. Could palliative care have helped them? Interventions, we're talking about that tomorrow, how to avert suicide. So conclusions, there have been extraordinary differences between nations in their rates and patterns of suicide. Understanding reasons for these changes will help us to understand why people kill themselves. So that's my contribution to prevention. The fact that late life suicide rates have fallen substantially in some countries, but less so in Taiwan, needs explanation. The suicide rate of non-elderly males in Taiwan nearly doubled to a peak and the female rates then fell. And the non-elderly female age pattern is now almost flat. Very interesting. And reasons why suicide rates are currently reported to be higher in Taiwan than in Australia can be discussed. And is it partly, I don't know what it might be. We need to discuss that. Sociocultural factors, etc. So that's my rushed presentation.